Good afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased this afternoon on Radio BVM to have historian, author, and opera enthusiast Henry Ewert in the studio with us today. Among his many accomplishments, Henry is the author of 4 books about the BC Electric Railway. He's received several awards for his work, including the prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Railroad Historical Association. And Henry is no stranger to radio and to the history of music. He was a broadcaster for CBC's Armed Forces FM radio network in Germany and studied music at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. He's also a founder of the Opera Club and teaches special music courses for Simon Fraser University. A very diverse career. So Henry, please tell us, what was it that got you interested and excited about the history of the BC Electric Railway?
It was really very easy. I was born in Vancouver in 1937, and I lived with my parents, an only child, in the Mount Pleasant district of Vancouver. And best of all, that was only 2 blocks away from the streetcar barn, a double-storied streetcar barn, where the streetcars, about 300 of them every day, came to rest after a long day. And what a great place to play and get dirty and go down into the pits and oil up and get spanked when I got home.
That's a wonderful story. My dad lived near the railway area in Lethbridge, of course, which was a central area, and he had a similar story. We were very excited about railways all of his life.
The streetcars were inescapable.
Now, the first book that you published about the history of the BC Electric Railway was back in 1986, and I'm just wondering, how has enthusiasm for the BCER changed in the time since 1986? What have you seen?
I think it's become even more raised than it was at that time. The book was written, it was actually commissioned for Expo 86, and since that time, as you've noted, I've written 4 books. The 3 others came after that book simply, more than anything else, because people seem to want to know more about the BC Electric. And just speaking for myself, I'm continuously doing lectures, demonstrations, shows, and talks on the BC Electric. There's obviously an interest that seems to be proportional to the length of time we've been without the interurbans and streetcars.
Do you think that in today's world, where we're also increasingly concerned about environmental sustainability, that looking back on this form of electric transportation has been part of that enthusiasm?
I think it has. The wires, which were on top or above the streetcars and interurbans, were the unsightly part of the operation. And the tracks, well, they were there, but in the city streets they could be really quite well masked. But this was environmentally friendly travel on a large scale. And anyone who's been to Europe and in other parts of the world as well can attest to the fact that streetcars and interurbans do live in a big way, and they are environmentally friendly.
And I think we have a very special place in our hearts for the electric railways and the history of the BCER in Burnaby, of course. As you know, a line was built through Burnaby in 1891, connecting New Westminster and Vancouver. And it was a year later that the district municipality of Burnaby was incorporated. So we sometimes say that Burnaby was born because of the interurban railway. Can you tell us a little bit more about the creation of that railway line in 1891?
Indeed. 1891 was a good year, so was 1890. A depression would come in 1893, but building was occurring. Vancouver got streetcars in 1891, and the Westminster and Vancouver Tramway was incorporated to build from New Westminster to Vancouver, and that was the way of looking at it. New Westminster actually, which few people know, had the CPR railway from across Canada before Vancouver had it. New Westminster had been incorporated in 1859, Vancouver in 1886, and they were in the early years competitors in a big way, and Burnaby was the beneficiary. These 2 cities had to be connected with each other, and were in October 1891, and development followed, of course, in Burnaby. It must have been quite extraordinary to see how people could come out easily, state-of-the-art transit, into Burnaby, buy property cheaply, live close to one of the 13 or 14 stations that were all along the line, and get to New Westminster in the market or into downtown Vancouver very easily.
And of course, that line, the right-of-way for that line through Burnaby, is essentially the route of the Expo line for the SkyTrain today.
It is indeed, and that Expo line, the SkyTrain line, opened in 1986. Passenger service started January 3rd, and it follows beautifully the old 1891 interurban line. And why not? Passenger development of homes along the way, along a kind of a hog's back, especially in Burnaby going east, from which one can look both north and south, developed quickly, and yes, the interurban stopped in 1953, and it took many years, 30 years, for a SkyTrain system to come into business, but it followed that same alignment generally.
And of course, there were two other interurban railways that went through Burnaby, the Burnaby Lake Line and the Westminster Eburn Line. Do you want to tell us a bit about those lines?
Yes, of course. The Central Park Line, as it was called, the main line between Vancouver and New Westminster through Burnaby, was double-tracked just before 1910. Business was big. So we needed more transportation through Burnaby. That one interurban line, this was well and good, and things were developing well. But BC Electric saw that there could be further development, and so did Burnaby. So in 1911, an interurban line bent off Commercial Drive in Vancouver at 6th Avenue, headed east, and along the southern shore of Burnaby Lake, to Sapperton and right down into New Westminster, and this began operation in 1911. And just a year before that, from Marpole at the south end of what is today Vancouver, but which was then South Vancouver, an interurban line was built from Marpole to New Westminster, and that actually opened in 1909. So by 1911, there were 3 interurban lines operating through Burnaby. Burnaby was being populated. There were a few roads, of course, Douglas Road, an iconic road, but the 3 interurban lines can be said not only to have built Burnaby, but the Marpole-New Westminster line along the Fraser River allowed sawmilling, milling of different kinds to be introduced along the river, and was a real source of industry.
Yeah, no, of course, people often think about the passenger service aspect of the BC Electric Railway, but there was actually a significant freight role overall, and I believe particularly on that Westminster Eburn line.
On the line and Eburn became Marpole, by the way, in 1916, but freight along that line, and today as well, freight was a big consideration. Passenger service, not so much, although it was a good connector between south end of Vancouver and New Westminster, but certainly extra runs were always in vogue and very, very necessary for all the workers in the various industries and mills along that line. The one line which never developed a freight business in any way was the Burnaby Lake Line. And that line, as I mentioned earlier, begun and finished in 1911. Much of it is under Highway 1 today. So if you're driving along the freeway, maybe there'll be a ghost of an interurban. Probably not. And there was actually a number of spur lines that served industry, where the freight trains could come and deliver supplies or take goods away. I believe there was one at Ocala, at Burnaby, and we saw some on the Burnaby-New Westminster border as well. I guess that was kind of a common occurrence throughout the system. It really was, but the Central Park Line, the original 1891 connector between New Westminster and Vancouver, developed freight in a big way, and did so even more actually after the interurban was gone. Interurban was gone in 1954 from that line. And through the eastern part of Burnaby, things really developed. I should tuck in here that in 1912, as freight was developing, the line into New Westminster, which would become a streetcar line, was far too steep. So a cutoff line was built. Now we're moving east along the Central Park line, and we get to Buller. And Buller was Highland Park Station. And in 1912, a new circling line was built down into New Westminster, and today the SkyTrain runs right over top of it. But that line, which, with its more easy grades, allowed freight to develop in a big way. I easily remember diesel locomotives of BC Hydro, BC Electric's successor, coming through Burnaby and working in all the way to Vancouver to a foundry at Nanaimo Street. Even today, if one wants to see what's left of that original 1891 line, just go into Burnaby, Nelson Street, off Imperial, just a little bit south, and look east, and there, wonder of all wonders, is the line. Even though single track now, the original line still lying there. And east of Royal Oak, I should mention, this is where the industrial part really came into big play. To look at a trackage map of all the freight installations that BC Electric and its successor BC Hydro handled there in Burnaby is to be amazed today. It's all gone today.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And when you think about the SkyTrain lines coming in, and they're certainly recreating that mass transit of people, but that freight service is something that we haven't replicated.
Not at all, no.
Now, you did mention a moment ago one of the streetcar lines, the one that went between New Westminster and Burnaby. So there were actually two streetcar lines that served Burnaby, one in the north and one connecting to New Westminster. Can you tell us a bit about those lines?
Indeed. The first one, when the line was opened between New Westminster and Vancouver in 1891, from New Westminster, it was really a streetcar line there as well. It did double duty. It allowed the interurbans to come into New Westminster and leave, of course, but it also operated as a streetcar line from Columbia Street as far as 6th and 6th. Now, this was a very devious line. It went east along Columbia to just this side of McBride, curled back on Royal, then over to Queen's Park, finally winding up on 6th and then up to Edmonds. Now, from Edmonds, it went west and connected up at Highland Park, which I alluded to earlier, which was at Buller Street. Now, this is how the streetcar service worked. From Edmonds, one line went down 12th, or Kingsway, as some think of it, and this is East Burnaby. The other line, and that was from 1893, the other line, the 1891 line, went from Edmonds and Kingsway east to 8th, said 6th earlier, but no, it is 6th, and down 6th and into New Westminster. So these streetcar lines worked very efficiently until 1937. If you were leaving Vancouver, heading through Burnaby, and you wanted to go into New Westminster, but not into downtown New Westminster, you got off at that Highland Park station. A streetcar was waiting for you, and it went cascading east through Edmonds, and as I said earlier, then down 6th and into New Westminster. The connection was very sure east and west, and it gave Eastern Burnaby contiguous to New Westminster very effective streetcar service. Now, in the north of Burnaby, when we drive along Hastings Street, east from Boundary Road in Vancouver, we can notice very, very quickly how well built up this area is, and it's absolutely because of the streetcar line. This was the only streetcar line thrust in from Vancouver. The contract with the city of Burnaby, municipality at that time, was for a streetcar line along Hastings 10,000 feet long. Well, that brought it to Ellesmere Street in Capitol Hill, and that line was opened in early 1913. One of the very last streetcar lines to be opened because automobiles were already on the horizon. There were quite a few of them. But this streetcar line was opened in 1913 and would operate until 1949. Those were the streetcar operations of BC Electric in Burnaby. The two lines close to New Westminster, and then the line thrust in from Hastings Street at the northwest corner of Burnaby.
What I find amazing about the streetcar line in North Burnaby, when you look at photographs of the opening of that line, there's a series of photos, I know you're familiar with them, of the officials at the end of the line at Ellesmere. And it is really in the middle of nowhere at that point. There's very little development. You see forests all around them. So it really goes back to that point you raised about the 1891 line, where the public transportation in Burnaby really precedes the population.
Absolutely. And the SkyTrain is our living monument to that even today. And the development along Hastings, particularly at Willingdon. Why at Willingdon and Hastings so much? Well, this was a single track. There wasn't much service out to Capitol Hill, but at Willingdon was the passing track. So the streetcars, east and west, would pass at that point. And obviously this was a place to pop out, maybe do banking quickly, or get off there, do a little shopping, and wait for the next streetcar to come along. And the development really predicated on how we could move people. And roads as we have them today, it goes really without saying that there was nothing like that. Robert Louis Stevenson had written about 50 years before that railways going on tracks gave travel a spiritual dimension. Well, I'm sure Burnabyites really felt that getting on an interurban, getting on a streetcar, and actually getting somewhere was extraordinary. And something about the fares, too. I rode the second last Burnaby Lake Interurban in 1953 in October from Vancouver right to Sapperton, and the fare was 26 cents. And that was not a student fare, that was an adult fare. So not only relative to how little development there had been of roads, but also economically, fares were very, very good. For Burnaby residents, there were settlers' fares, and these tickets were almost given away. It was something like 10 tickets for 35 cents. I remember reading about 10 tickets for 29 cents. So it was very, very easy to come and go for everyone.
Now, you talked about being on one of those last runs on the Burnaby Lake line. So by the 1950s, most of these streetcar and interurban lines had slowly been closed down. The last runs were in 1958. What happened? Why did they stop operating?
They stopped operating more than anything else because it was just easier to have your own car, and so many of us had cars by that time. And buses seemed to have a flexibility, which they do even today, that transcended what interurbans and streetcars could do. And there was no awareness, as far as I can remember, of the pollution which buses and automobiles wreaked on our atmosphere, on our breathing. There was no note of that at all. There was simply an excitement which began after the war, when anything rubber-tired seemed to be heaven sent. And this was also an aspect of it. When there was going to be paving was expensive. Should we put the tracks back in? That will cost the merchants and the residents along the line more. No, let's not. Let's not put the tracks back in when we do our repaving. Let's take the tracks out, and that will make our taxes cheaper. That will simply make it economically more viable for us as merchants to continue in business. So that was in play as well. Now, the interurban line to New Westminster, our 1891 one, this had a handicap, and that was, as we developed, the first 3.6 miles from Vancouver were run on city streets, from Carroll and Hastings out to Clark, up to Venables, and then on Commercial Drive, and finally at 18th onto its own right-of-way. So that made movement very, very slow. SkyTrain would remedy that, of course, by going over top of everything. Interesting thing about SkyTrain, the route it takes through Falls Creek is a route that BC Electric lusted after doing. There were many discussions. There were even plans in place to bring the interurban from 18th, from Cedar Cottage, down through China Creek, down to the flats where the railways are now, and into downtown Vancouver. BC Electric knew well that that was the Achilles heel, that 3.6 miles of street running on this great line in Westminster. That was the Achilles heel that would eventually strangle it. The last interurban line you referred to was the one from Marpole out to Steveston, and that kept running until 1958. But it had that extra time only because there was a wait for the Oak Street Bridge to be completed. And once it was complete and bus grids were in place, it was gone. But I have to say that the last interurban in Burnaby ran on the Marpole to Westminster line on November 18, the day has to be noted, November 18, 1956. There were two interurban cars on it, 1203, a wooden car built, believe it or not, in 1904, and interurban car 1223, which is right here in Burnaby. The two last interurban cars to run in Burnaby, after 65 years of operation in Burnaby, one of them is right here on site. And I'm anxious to mention who the motormen were, or motorman was, and the conductor on the last run on the Marpole to Westminster line through Burnaby. Tom Pritchard was the motorman. Lawrence Love was the conductor.
That's wonderful. I hadn't heard that story before, Henry. Every time I talk to you, I learn something new.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for being with us today on Radio BVM.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure.